Hello, and welcome to the 30th episode of the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy series. Today is Monday, 18th of November 2019, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. We battled through the trot smorgasbord that is the end of Chapter 8, Political Consciousness. This week, I have the new Patreon, Nicholas Green, to thank. You too can help keep the good ship Alpha afloat by joining the Patreon gang for as little as $5 a month, which works out at $1 an episode. Patrons get special bonus episodes, the right to vote in the reading group series, and other cool stuff too. We are closing in on the magic 100 patrons, which means we'll be producing a second Patreon-only podcast every month. If you can't afford the dollars to become a patron, you can always help me out by doing some editing on the show. Hit me up on Twitter or Facebook if you're interested. If you'd like to comment on the show, please do so on the YouTube channel. Make sure to like, subscribe and share, etc. 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 Okay, to the discussion. If you actually look on the YouTube picture there, you'll see that I did something like the first 25 episodes with the word strategy misspelled in the logo. I spelled it strategy with two G's instead of two T's.
Oh my god. First as tragedy, then as farce.
Yeah. Strategy. So they had as well, like it took 25, it took nearly like 6 months of these podcasts being released for anybody to notice it, which may say something about the content of the podcast. Now, here we're back after a bit of a delay. We have a full panel here today. We have got, coming all the way from Arizona, we have got the two-headed beast that is Lex Soph.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, I'm the other head.
Hi, I'm the other head. This is Lex in Arizona celebrating our first anniversary for the weekend in the nerdiest fucking way possible.
Yeah. Happy communism anniversary.
Oh god, that's good. Okay, and they're making some machine noises of his own was Puya, all the way now from, is it Madrid?
Studying here, yes.
In an autonomous zone, no doubt. We also then have all the way from Cougar Country, which is not true because it's more a semi-arid desert, is Kyle Thompson. No, that's not where, that's where you grew up. You're in like rancher country. I don't know where the hell you are. Kyle, who are you and where are you from?
This is Kyle from General Intellect Unit, but also from Calgary, which is, oil country. And also there are farms, lots of farms around here.
I feel like every week Tom butchers where people are from. Why is that, Tom?
I mean, I at least remember that, Kyle's in Canadian, right?
Yeah, Canadian Texas.
That stuck with me.
Yeah, well, what I would say to you, Sophie, is that essentially what all of you say is of such minute importance that my brain sorts it out and puts it in the bin.
Yeah, so basically we
What do you say to that?
Yeah, is that what you're saying?
Well, you roboted up there a wee bit, so I don't know what you said. And therefore, I'll put you in the bin again. Now, we've got the last time we sat down together, we're struggling to get through chapter 8, and there's a lot of crazy ass trot speak stuff going to hit us today, but there's no point in doing what we're doing if we're going to chicken out from the real super hardcore now that we've like 25 episodes in. So we're going to start here in chapter 8. I'm going to get into the Fourth International and Trotsky, Cominternalism, bureaucratic centralism. Let's start with Trotsky's call for the Fourth International, and let's kick off with Sophie. Hopefully, if Sophie's audio is working okay, let's hit it. Worth calling Sophie and Lexi. Oh, they're gone. Well, that answers that. Let me start then with Trotsky's call for the Fourth International. This background character of Comintern helps to explain the peculiar character of Trotsky's decision in 1933 to denounce it as dead for the purposes of world revolution and call for a new Fourth International. The peculiarity of this decision is the fact that Trotsky denounced the Third International on the basis of events in a single country, i.e. Germany, The First International had been founded on the explicit basis of the international tasks of the proletariat as a class. The second, more indefinitely, on the basis of the international common character of the proletariat's interests and struggles. The third, at least formally, had been founded on the failure of the second in World War I. To denounce the Comintern and call for a new international on the basis of defeat in a single country was therefore something quite new, even if the country, Germany, had been the historical centre of the Second International and home to one of the strongest communist parties. Trotsky seems to have imagined that the Comintern would be defined forever by the disaster in Germany, as the Second International was defined forever by August 1914. The choice to support the existing states in a war did indeed turn out to be a permanent choice that defines the Labourite and Socialist parties to this day. But 1933 was not comparable to August 1914. By 1935, the Comintern had abandoned the sectarian third period politics that led to the disaster of 1933 and turned to the People's Front policy. In spite of a brief return to the third period during the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939-41, the People's Front was to be the main strategic line of official communism, permanently, and still is today. The third period and its role in the disaster in Germany has become a matter of interest to historians and Trotskyists. In 1933, the call for a Fourth International was therefore plainly premature. It was only with the People's Front turn, as communists more and more plainly abandoned both working class political independence and criticism of the Social Democrats, that the Trotskyist project began to win broader support. Even then, the growth was limited. The Fourth International, founded in 1938, could only account for about 7,500 organised militants worldwide. Part of the explanation for Trotsky's premature call for the Fourth International is that, as can be seen from his writings in the 1930s, he had become fully convinced that Lenin was right and he was wrong between 2003 and 2017. He was therefore determined not to do anything that could amount to conciliationism or postponing the necessary struggle to create a new party and a new international. Okay, so what do people think about it? Kyle, what do you make of all that?
So first of all, I just thought it would be useful to clarify what specifically Trotsky had become convinced of by Lenin in that period between 1903 and 1917. So can anybody speak to that?
I have no idea.
Is this not the party form? Is this not the Menshevik versus the Bolshevik split? Was that 1906?
Well, it's between 1903 and 1917. That's a lot of time, right? So determined not to do anything that could amount to conciliationism or postponing the necessary struggle to create a new party and a new international. So yes, that is definitely the split, right? And it's also taking a independent class line, perhaps, right? Because it's against conciliationism. So it's sort of like hardline split with the Second International, I guess.
Was that the Bolshevik split? Were they not in the...
Well, because they didn't split with the Mensheviks right away. Yeah. I feel like this is underexplained here. The rest of this stuff is fairly clear in terms of why Trotsky decided to split with the Third International and why that could be arguably premature. Because, yeah, this line, the third period line that the Comintern took, was a very brief episode in the history of the Comintern.
Explain to people what the third period was.
Now, this was the struggle against social democracy, right? This was the struggle against the Second International parties that the Comintern did during that period of 33 to 35 and then 39 to 41. So basically declaring them to be like, what was it, allies of fascism, right? This is social fascism argument. And then the line that they took generally was the People's Front line, which was about class collaborationism in the name of sort of like national struggles.
which was, I mean, a total, and that was like a total disaster. And the People's Front.
It was the one that stuck around like all the way into Euro communism, right?
Another important thing about the People's Front was that period was inadequate support of revolutionary movements where they sprung up. Because I think it was in the interest of a Soviet state at that time. Like here in Spain during the Civil War and that period, between the fighting with the Republicans and the Nationalists were so well armed in comparison to the Republican forces and the left forces. And the Soviet Union, I think they were just pursuing their national interest with this policy by not conflicting with the capitalist world.
So what we're saying here is that after the problems of World War One, that the communist strategy was to attack the right of the left, so the Social Democrats. And this led to the disaster of basically the far right being able to, because they had basically started fighting each other. It led to the rise of Hitler, and that was a disaster. And after that, they changed tack. The Comintern changed and said, okay, we got to all unite against Hitler. And it wasn't until after that had happened that the Fourth International actually started doing well in 1938. What year did Trotsky do the Third International? It was 33, and it wasn't until 38 then that it started to actually grow. That's basically his point. He thinks it was premature to have done it because of a disaster in one country. And the only reason it actually started growing is because of the basically total flip-flopping in strategy from the Comintern.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And we're saying here that Trotsky, the final bit there, just trying to make sense of this, he's saying Trotsky prematurely did this because I don't see why he thought, why prematurely that would make sense. If in 1933 they were still attacking each other, the communists and the Social Democrats were attacking each other, which is kind of what Lenin's, I don't know if it was what Lenin would say, but it's where you have a strict class politics. Why would he have done it in 33?
Yeah, it's not totally clear because the argument here is that the defeat in Germany was what precipitated the Fourth International. And Trotsky did that because of his adherence to Lenin's line. But I don't see what the connection is exactly. I'm just not that deep into the subject that I can follow McNair's thinking.
Oh, hi there. Did somebody say my name?
Yay.
What did we go over? So we're talking about the why Trotsky broke from the Third International. Did we go over what Trotsky and Lenin disagreed about from 1903 to 1917?
We went over it to the extent that we couldn't figure out what the disagreement was specifically. So if you could enlighten us, that would be much appreciated.
That's simple. Trotsky was not a Bolshevik for that point in time. He was not quite a convinced Menshevik. He had something of a middle position. I mean, I wouldn't say it exactly converges on where the Menshevik opposition in the Soviet Union ends up, but the ones that don't go with the Tsar. But Trotsky was a sort of middle figure up until that point. He wasn't convinced about I don't know. There's a bunch of things that he wasn't convinced about, but I think you can basically sum it up to Bolshevism, even Bolshevism in the earlier form, where in the debates between Martov and Lenin, Trotsky was a bit of a middle figure, and part of this was, I think it was something along the lines of the sort of permanent revolution line, or what ends up becoming permanent revolution.
But then if that's the case, and Trotsky moved away from his position that he held in that period, why would he break with the Third International over sectarianism? The third period politics were sectarian politics.
Well, basically what happens is that there's that tripartite structure of kind of Soviet politics after Lenin, after the sort of, I don't know, the Troika sort of dissolves, which is the immediate sort of, triumvirate after the death of Lenin. And then there's the right opposition usually Nikolai Bukharin is the figurehead of that. It's sort of like a controlled retreat position that, we need kind of liberal institutions and capitalism. There's this left opposition position where we need the proletariat to assert its might against the peasantry. And we also need like a world revolution. We need to be more aggressive with capitalist powers. And then there's Stalin in the middle. And Stalin was able to play these oppositional bits off of each other really well. And the reason why I think Trotsky ends up feeling this way about third period mode is because that's when Stalin starts to angle himself left and to start attacking the right opposition from the left. While doing this, he makes an enemy of Trotsky. This is where, Stalin had it out for Trotsky for a long time, but like, this is where Stalin starts to pick up some of Trotsky's like rhetoric, some of Trotsky's positions. He's getting outflanked by Stalin essentially in the internal politics of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but McNair is making the argument that this comes out of the German case,
right?
Which is what is confusing to me here.
So I think that's what's confusing to McNair is that specifically the call for the Fourth International came from the failure of the German Communist Party, and I think what the point that McNair is making, in essence, is that it's kind of irrational. It's hard to understand like why, of all things, that is the thing that Trotsky decides to break with the Comintern over, because he goes into the example of why the Comintern broke with the Second International, which is like, there was kind of like a multinational implication, even though it was an issue in one country, again, Germany. The Social Democratic Party in Germany decided to support Germany in World War I, whereas Trotsky was kind of looking at this very minutia example of the German Communist Party failing, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think we've stressed in previous episodes that that's like the role that the German Revolution had in the minds of the old Bolsheviks as being, the guarantor of the revolution. But yeah, I think that's, the way that McNair frames it is that Trotsky basically is so destroyed by the way that Third International strategy pans out in Germany that he thinks it's sabotaging the world revolution. That's like the best answer I can give.
Yeah, so I can kind of follow that argument that like, Trotsky framed this as a matter of strategy in Germany, but there was, in fact, in the background, internal Soviet politics that informed his decision. And that makes some sense to me. It's just, the way McNair presents it here is like kind of hard to follow.
Yeah, and
it's almost flippant.
It makes me like a little, I don't know what's the word. Like going by his argument, like I can understand what he's saying, but it makes me a little uncomfortable. He's kind of like, well, he shouldn't have broke until like 5 years later, He shouldn't have like basically predicted what, that this was going to get worse, not better. That Trotsky should have, stuck it out with the Third International for another 5 years.
Yeah, maybe he broke with the International for kind of like very surface level or maybe even like silly reasons, but he did the right thing for not great reasons. It sounds like, in my opinion, like I don't see what the value of hanging out with the Third International is at pretty quickly, like by 1920, basically.
I guess the point being that Trotskyism in the left opposition takes the early Third International as part of its position.
Yes.
And so if you're going by that, then I guess I can see this argument.
I think it boils down to we're not Trotskyists, so it doesn't make much sense to us why any of this doesn't make any sense.
But just from a sort of if-then standpoint.
Right.
If you accept the first four Congresses, then.
Okay, let's move it along. Let's go on to Cominternmism. Sophie, your mic is working. Do you want to give this a read?
Sure. There is, however, another and in some ways more fundamental aspect. Trotsky's conception both of international left opposition, ILO, formed in 1930, and the projected Fourth International was that they were to be a revival and continuation of the Comintern of 1919 through 1923. The documents of the first four Congresses of the Comintern were part of the ILO's platform and of its successors, the International Communist League. This unavoidably meant that the ILO ICL, and Fourth International carried in their roots ideas of a chain of national revolutions starting now, perhaps somewhere other than in Russia, and of an international whose task was mainly to create parties of the Bolshevik type in every country. On the one hand, this meant that the feats and disasters in single countries formed the real basis of the critique of the Comintern, and of the critique of those such as the Spanish POUM and the French PSOP, with whom the Trotskyists broke on the road to the Fourth International. On the other, the idea of tasks of the International as such, in constructing international unity of the working class in action, had no strategic ground in the Trotskyist ideas. A tiny group, of course, could do little practical along these lines, but the Fourth International was bound to appear as a micro-miniature Comintern with a leftist version of Comintern strategy. The Fourth International also inherited from the Third the utter centrality of the defense of the Russian Revolution and hence of the USSR in wars with capitalist states to its identity and program. In 1939 through 40, this position was to split it down the middle over the Russo-Finnish War and the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland, with Trotsky insisting that the minority in the US and elsewhere should not have the right to express its views in public. The minority took a third of the membership of the US Socialist Workers' Party, the largest group represented in the 1938 Congress, and half of the International Executive Committee elected at that Congress.
Okay.
Rip.
We got them splits. Those splits, babies.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that this is starting to make a little bit of sense, because what he's saying is that the decision to split over what happened in Germany created a precedent where events in individual countries became seen as central matters to split over in the future, right? And also that this framework that the Trotskyists inherited from the decision to split over Germany meant that international strategy had no substantial figuring in their considerations, and national considerations ended up taking up the central point.
So like the failure of individual revolutions became reasons for splits as opposed to international revolution.
I believe that's what he's saying, yes.
It's funny here as well that Trotsky, he's saying here, Trotsky held on to the Comintern's structures. So they were not very democratic. Am I right in saying that? He says,
oh, yeah.
A revival of the Comintern in 1919 to 23 and all those TCs, which we basically slandered in the previous episodes.
So I think he gets into this in the next section, but part of what he argues is that like the original ideas of the Fourth International and the left opposition were democratic and was founded on the idea of factions are necessary and good, or the implication at least. Mm-hmm. And then towards the end of Trotsky's life, his last legacy is this split and silencing of a minority faction. And so that kind of leads Trotskyism, or the legacy of Trotskyism, especially in the post-war period, to just kind of capitulate a lot of the same issues that Stalinism or, bureaucratic centralism, whatever, all those same mistakes, basically.
I would just asterisk that, and I don't think the first four congresses of the Comintern are like pro-faction necessarily.
That's true.
I think the ban on factions comes from that period.
But that is true, but I think it's also true that Trotsky's own foundational documents for these organizations, I think McNair goes into this, but basically he explicitly says democracy is key. And there is an implication that if he is founding a left opposition faction, which is an illegal faction,
right,
then why should he not allow factions in his own organization?
Yeah, the overall structure of the argument is that, pluralist Cominternism ends up being like a contradiction in terms.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's hit the next bit. Bureaucratic centralism. Lexi, do you want to give a read?
Let's flex it.
Flex it with the Lexus.
Yeah, that's right. All right. The refusal to accept public factions in 1940 was in contradiction with the Trotskyists' own history. The Trotskyist movement had originated in the 1920s as an illegal public faction of the Russian Communist Party, and the ILO, launched in 1930, had been an illegal public faction of Comintern. The Russian oppositions, indeed, had as part of their core politics a critique of bureaucratism, albeit one that was cautious and imperfectly articulate. Part of this critique survived in the culture Trotsky sought to create in the ILO and ICL, International Left Opposition and International Communist League. The 1933 resolution, the International Left Opposition, its tasks and methods, said that the foundation of party democracy is timely and complete information available to all members of the organization and covering all the important questions of their life and struggle. Discipline can be built up only on a conscious assimilation of the policies of the organization by all its members and on confidence in the leadership. Such confidence can be won only gradually in the course of common struggle and reciprocal influence. The frequent practical objections based on the loss of time in abiding by democratic methods amount to short-sighted opportunism. The education and consolidation of the organization is a most important task. Neither time nor effort should be spared for its fulfillment. Moreover, party democracy, as the only conceivable guarantee against unprincipled conflicts and unmotivated splits, in the last analysis, does not increase the overhead costs of development, but reduces them. Only through constant and conscientious adherence to the methods of democracy can the leadership undertake important steps in its own responsibility in truly emergency cases, without provoking disorganization or dissatisfaction. These statements are a standing rebuke to the post-war Trotskyists.
Well, like, I don't want to interject, but like, that's like a piss take.
I mean, like, I remember reading so much Trotsky when I was younger, and I hadn't really internalized what the Civil War meant. You know, a bunch of people tried to tell me, but, you know, sometimes you just don't want to hear what's wrong with your new love affair. You know, you just, okay, yeah, I know you all care about me and you're listening, but
I'll tell you what's wrong with your love affair. They got a lousy internet connection.
Well, I could fix that. It's the only thing I'm good at. Oh, but yeah. I mean, there's so much beautiful prose about Trotsky, you know, waxing poetic about how important democracy is, or this or that. But like, I just remember trying to stand Trotsky to like left communists, and their eyes would just glaze over, and I'd be like, "What? What's wrong?" And they're just like, "This guy didn't do that stuff when he had the chance." I think I might have made the comparison to like Obama, or like what people say after they're in power in the United States, and all the nice ideas people come up with after they had a chance to implement them. And I mean, you see this like the same like kind of schizoid like position on this sort of stuff. I mean, it's kind of what Marxism is famous for at this point, like high-minded promises of, you know, democracy and whatever. But when it comes down to it, I mean, it's less democratic than bourgeois institutions. But
it seems to me to be a reliance overly on the political.
Right.
You know, when you deal with the people in, you know, Marxist, Trot group, whatever, right, the emphasis is entirely on the political. And does this political ruse help me to attract a person right now? And do I have to change every single tenet of what I proclaimed as my beliefs to do it? And they go, yeah, all right, grand, yeah, let's do it. It's very instrumental. Oh, like nearly every organization I've ever come across is like that.
And I think a point that McNair was making at the end of that last section there is that the decisions that Trotsky made at the end of his life both established a precedent for certain political situations to be the basis for splitting, and also established a precedent for the suppression of political opposition within the organization. And so what the result of that is that you have this argument for democracy in the organization. You have the argument for the centrality of given political crises. And then you also have the argument for the suppression of democracy.
Right.
And that creates a kind of basis for infinite splitting down the line. because there's strong arguments to be made on both sides, and because of the suppression of minority factions in the organization, the only way to express your opposition on any given subject is to split.
Or to become an alcoholic.
Let's see. Can I read the rest of the page? Because
absolutely,
kind of drives the point home. The aspirations of the 1933 resolution above were at least partly reflected in the conduct of the international secretariats of the International Left Opposition and International Communist League, and in Trotsky's correspondence. The secretariats were willing to accept partial splits and public fights in the sections, and Trotsky urged the creation of horizontal relations between the sections, as well as vertical section secretariat relations. However, Trotsky's response to the 1939 through 1940 minority that rejected Soviet defensism was bureaucratic centralist, and it drew on the idea of splits as purging and proletarianizing the movement that had been initiated in the split in the Second International, as we saw in Chapter 5. Trotsky was assassinated in 1940. His writings on the U.S. 1939 through 40 split thus left, as his last legacy to the post-war Trotskyists, bureaucratic centralism and the idea of the proletarianizing and purging split. So,
well, we all know now, all you have to do is to look to, say, Romania and Ceausescu and some of these places that, by splitting and getting that pure communist party, that it really got rid of any of these people who were, dodgy or had ulterior motives or slightly on the fascist side. So,
right, yeah.
That's a great strategy.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't select for the most organizationally adept and, most craven people that are willing to say or do anything. Certainly not.
Not at all. No, that's not the legacy of Stalinism at all.
Wink. I mean, and no, the problem is Stalinism is not a broad enough category.
No.
And that's the ultimate heartbreaker of Trotskyism, is that you have this heroic myth of the guy that was, hard enough to go through with the Russian Revolution, but, ultimately, he knew what was, he knows what's wrong. It's this bureaucracy stuff. In the 30s, he sounds like a counselist, like Anton Pannekoek, about, we have no models. All we have are these legacies of failures we have to learn from. He sounds like a real mature guy. But when it comes down to it, you can't not stand for the Soviet Union. Yeah. You can't defy the bases of the Third International. When it comes down to it, that's actually the fault line. It's not any of these high-minded ideals. And right. it leads a lot of people to question, what would the USSR under Trotsky have really looked like? Certainly probably would have been less anti-Semitic to a degree. No doctor's plot maybe. But, what would have been different? And that's a rhetorical question.
I've a controversial thing to say here now. Do we bring this back to Lenin? The reason I say this is that I've recently been just yesterday I was watching a lecture from Communist University from a few years ago by a guy called Ian Burchell, and he was doing it on Alfred Rosmer's Lenin's Moscow. Has anybody read this?
I have not.
No. Nope.
And basically, he was some French dude who knew Lenin around the time. But he was saying that he went over and was chatting to Lenin. And after the 21 Theses were released, and he was saying, when said to him, look, I think we shouldn't, follow that split because it looks like the communist section in France are going to actually take over, the left party, whatever it was at the time. And it's looking very promising for us to get in control of the Social Democrats. And Lenin's like, oh, that's excellent news. Maybe I was wrong. He said, I can't remember exactly the words he was saying. Maybe I need to rethink my 21 Theses. But that was 1920 or something.
Right.
21. Yeah. And he never rethought anything. I think it was 21, but it wasn't he wasn't on his deathbed when it happened.
No. Yeah.
It didn't affect him. They're making out this guy, Lenin was this really nice guy. He was able to admit his faults and all this, blah, blah. But did he change the goddamn policy?
Right. Well, I think
that's what matters. It's not about whether he was nice in person.
I mean, I think I've said this before on this podcast, more or less, but I think Lenin's legacy is a legacy that's like complex, and if you're going to be a Marxist, you have to grapple with it. And I think we should try to grapple with it honestly. I don't really agree with like ultra leftists or anarchists who are just thinking he's an evil bad guy. But I also think a lot of the people in the milieu that comes out of this book, this McNairist book, they don't all grapple with Lenin's legacy honestly either. Like, I think there's no way to separate Lenin from Stalin insofar as a lot of what Lenin did led to Stalinism and led to Trotskyism's ultimate capitulation to Stalinism, really. So I think what Lexi said earlier kind of hinted at this, and that like the problem isn't necessarily Stalinism, the problem is Leninism. And I am one who believes that Lenin the man was better than Leninism, but I also think, Leninism is what it is because of what he did, and his last testament, I think, is just a sign of regret, not a sign of him being better, like I think he felt bad about what happened, but he did it. He's not alone. The old Bolsheviks did it, all of them, to a greater or lesser extent. And I don't think Leninists can deal with this, honestly. And I get why. Like, when you hear like anarchists or whoever finger wag about the evils of Lenin, I'm just kind of like roll my eyes. But there, that's not an honest. Nobody's really dealing with this honestly, I think.
Will we kick on? Anybody else have anything to say there?
Just that there's already a strong disposition in any principled small group to have the purifying split, and the Trotskyist legacy just encourages that even more, right?
Yeah.
So this is something that you'll find in a lot of small group psychology, that kind of stuff. But Trotskyism just really, really encourages that. And you see this rhetoric being used to justify it all the way down the line to progressively more and more relevant factions.
It gives it theoretical legitimacy as well.
Yeah. And
it one of the things that McNair is bringing up here is that, yes, it's theoretical, but it's also very particularist, right? Because it gives legitimacy to the idea of splitting over very specific issues in a very specific, like, national context. And that makes it even more likely to cause splits.
Yeah. I mean, you see this in religious organizations too, right? These like micro kind of these micro principles that become the basis for the split are often
not the Catholic Church. We stay true. We stay true over the millennia.
Of course not, dear.
But
these like micro principles that become the justifications for splits are often not the real reasons for the split.
No.
And that's why I bring up Trotsky within the Soviet Union, is because I highly suspect that his writings about, it's a German revolution and this and that, probably has less to do with it than him being outplayed within the Soviet Union, like outmaneuvered. I just, I don't think this, like, I don't actually believe that these splits are about what they say they're about after going through some of them myself. Like, people hang their hat on a legitimizing kind of justification that sounds good, that has a historical legacy, but a lot of times it's just an abuse of history to kind of justify narcissism of small differences. And when you don't have like a working class base or some kind of greater stakes involved to, get people to like, put their egos back in their pants, so to speak, and try to have to work with people you don't perfectly like or that you can't completely control. This is the impulse. And I think that's, I guess, the reason why McNair like sort of harps on the idea that this split was too early or something. And he's not dealing with it maybe as I would prefer him to. But basically that, like, McNair wants to argue that the split from the Second International was justified, but that splitting as just like a, strategic kind of panacea is a nightmare.
Yep. I have a question for Sophie. Sophie, do you have complete control over Lexi?
100%.
Good.
I'll let your imagination run wild with that one.
Only sometimes.
That's That's good. On this episode, you heard the theme tune The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters and The Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit and Swampside Chats.